give some encouragement by giving some protection. But even in those circumstances, the purchaser of the brownfield site has to do a cleanup, has to spend the money to make the site be safe enough that it can be used. And think about a site like Medicam, all right? Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent. Hundreds of millions more need to be spent. I'm skeptical, but I'm open to the possibility that somebody would say, yeah, I want to incur all that liability because I want to develop the Medicam site, as opposed to any other site that might be available in Newcastle County. So I think that the Act provides opportunities. I think it is less of a hurdle than some people want to do. And so I need to be convinced that we need to change the Act before I'd be willing to talk about or consider, okay, let's talk about changes. And from my perspective, part of it is, what changes are we talking about, right? Because it may, that will make a big difference. And I haven't heard what they are. There's just sort of this general concept of, gee, we need to ease the Act. And I'm skeptical until I have something more, because I see a lot of opportunity in the Act, and it's not being taken advantage of now.
I don't know if you wanted to, Jim, first.
Do you have any comments?
Yeah.
Brief, because I got one.
No, you get,
Okay.
you get the same as everybody else.
Well, first off, in my bio, there was something that was incorrect. I am a member of the League of Women Voters. I am not representing them here, nor I am the chair of whatever the committee was, environment and climate change or something like that. That committee doesn't even exist within the League of Women Voters at this point. So I am not representing the League of Women Voters in any way. But I am a member, and I'm happy to be a member of the league. What I see as the biggest problem in the coastal zone right now has nothing to do with what we're talking about at the moment. We're losing more of the coastal zone every year to sea level rise and subsidence. And if we don't figure out some way to make the Act, we've got to figure out what to do to save the coastal zone. Do we look at retreating? Do we look at stabilizing the coastal zone? And how do we pay for that? And how do we pay for the cleanup? It is true that, like it says in here, the only barrier to brownfield redevelopment is lack of funding. But as Professor Crystal pointed out, we're talking at the Medicam site, that's the worst example. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. State doesn't have that money. The federal government doesn't have the money to do it right away. And no industry is going to come in and pick up that site. But there are other sites that industry would be interested in picking up, that then they would be responsible to clean it up. And what we've talked about within the subcommittee at D is the possibility of having the offsets that the industries would be required to pay to go in the coastal zone. Right now, the offsets, I'm not sure how that works, but it goes into some fund within DENREC, and I don't know how they allocate that. But we could use money generated through the redevelopment of those sites to implement a fund to do the projects that we need to do, either purchase additional land so that the coastal zone can retreat, or to do projects to stabilize the coastal zone against sea level rise and storm surges. So I think we need to not look at this as so much us and them. We need to look at what we need to do to protect the coastal zone, because we all agree it's one of Delaware's greatest assets, and we're losing it. If we do nothing, we'll lose it. And we need to figure out some way of working together so that we can find the resources that we need in order to do what needs to be done in order to save the zone. If it can be done outside the Act, let's do it. if the act needs to be changed, let's just at least talk about it.
With me, the question that comes to mind so directly, I mean, Paul looks at the opportunities as well as you of economic development and people being more interested in utilizing those properties for industrial and residential and whatever else. That being, okay, industrial. It begs the question, it's been 15 months, I think, since they shut down Edgemore. It's now under Comores, it used to be part of DuPont. They've done some extensive work as far as excavating that stuff up, hauling it over to the incinerator they have, burning off a lot of the toxins and stuff in that soil, and trying to do what they can to take out the dioxins and other issues that existed on that property. Whether it's been completed or not, I don't know. I haven't seen any documentation. That being the case, if the demand for heavy industrial sites is so great and there's hundreds of millions of dollars out there just waiting to come in and help Delaware out, why hadn't anybody started using that property? It still falls within the 2 year window. Why isn't there a line standing at the door at Comores saying we want the property?
Well, I think the state of Delaware has expressed interest in that property.
That's why everybody
For the
else
port.
is waiting.
Okay, well, you pointed to the state coming in and intervening.
Well,
Your argument previously was that there are industries that are interested in coming into Delaware and utilizing the industrial areas that we might use if there were loosening of the regulations. Here is one large one. Give me one company or one group or one industry that's interested in coming to the Delaware coastline where they would benefit by the changes in regulations.
that's like Ken's point, and it's hard to prove a negative. I can tell you that people who I respect, who work with real estate locators, tell me that Delaware does not even make the list because of the Coastal Zone Act. They're just not interested in pursuing it. But let me bring up two items, and I'm kind of asking Ken this, but there was a case a few years ago where the oil recycler that's down on the Wilmington Riverfront proposed moving to the Conica site near Delaware City, across the street from the refinery, and that permit was turned down because that was judged to be a heavy industry and was prohibited by the law. Now, I don't know whether that was under 20 acres or whether they knew about that loophole. In fact, I'm just learning about this loophole tonight. And maybe it's something we ought to be closing or working together to come up with a solution that helps everybody. But so that's one case in my mind that we could have made productive use of the site. The other obvious one is what's happening up in Marcus Hook with the Sun Oil Refinery, which was closed down and about killed Marcus Hook. They were losing all those jobs. Now it's coming back because they're now refining natural gas liquids, and part of that facility is in Delaware, but there's no activity on the Delaware portion of it. Again, I don't know if it's more or less than 20 acres, but there's hundreds of millions of dollars of investment being made in southeastern Pennsylvania because of the shale gas. And but for, I think, and this is the case where but for the Coastal Zone Act, a sliver of Delaware could be, some of those jobs could be, an investment could be in Delaware. Now, whether or not the Comores site, Edgemore site, could be incorporated into a port system and repurposed and maybe need a coastal zone permit, or have a bulk loading facility that's prohibited by the Coastal Zone Act, I don't know, but I'm just saying there is potential, and I think the fact that when you're looking at heavy industry in particular, which has processes and retorts and columns and that sort of thing, so you're talking about a different type of capital investment than you would with, say, building a car factory or something like that, and a different level of remediation too. So I think it's a viable. We don't know for sure, and I'm not here arguing that making these changes is going to turn the Delaware economy around, but I think it gives us another tool to attract the kind kind of jobs that we know we need in this state, and at the same time, clean up some sites that aren't gonna get cleaned up otherwise. So to me, it's a win-win.
I'll give you, Ken.
Yeah,
Let John.
and I want to make a few remarks about a few things here. One, when I hear the phrase, another tool to attract businesses, we just did that with a $60 million corporate giveaway called the Delaware Coastal Zone Act, which is not going to create one job, which is not preserve one job, which in fact has going to cost the taxpayer $60 million in revenue. And now our budget deficit is $167 million less to be expected. But I also want to comment on Mr. Black's somehow convoluted conclusion that to protect the coastal zone, which is being threatened by, that heavy industry development of that zone would somehow remedy that. And let me bring you a case in point. We had the dioxin pile, which is not being remedied, not being renewed, not being incinerated, which was permitted by the DENREC to allow it to be kept in place and capped. I went out and visited that site. That site is right on the river. You don't need much sea level rise. All you need is a good storm. And that leaches out. At the bottom of that pile is benzene. It's not just the dioxin. So I wrote a law that would declare it a hazardous dump so that DuPont would be responsible to remove it, which it should be done because it is a threat. It's a threat to the neighborhood, and capping it is not underneath it. DuPont went to DENREC and said, that'll cost us $300 million. Now, I had some experts tell me that's a very inflated number, $300 million to move it. And DENREC said, we can't support your bill, Representative Kawapa, because it would cost more of the resources we have to enforce such a thing in challenging court. Now, that is a completely, I would say, a paradox, I don't know, oxymoronic attitude to have, that we're not going to enforce that. But when I see DuPont then transfer that site to Chemours, and you've all seen the movie 7 Degrees of Separation or whatever it's called. There are no degrees of separation. That was a deliberate deal cut. And when they did that, and they disavowed it, washed their hands of it, and you say, well, we can hold them responsible. No, you can't. Not in court. You would never win that case. Just as you can't hold responsible some of the asbestos companies that sell their product and then were sold as a utility or an entity to someone else, and now they've lost their responsibility in a court of law. Morally, they're still responsible. Now, Chemours even intends to move that site to a further ownership, but leaving it in place. When we talk about brownfield development, I'd gladly listen to someone who's coming in and spend, and I know it's not $300 million, but they can claim $300 million on their tax to remove that dioxin pile and then work in that place. But then to say that creating a brownfield site is at risk of ever having to be able to create a brownfield site is somehow discouraging industry from coming here. I don't see lines at the door. I don't buy into this promise them anything but give them our page. I don't live, and this economy is not going to live on a promise. The economy of Delaware is very much at risk now with the sheet tax challenge in the Supreme Court, with the giveaways, the corporate giveaways, with everything that we do in this state. We are almost assuring an economic failure that we have no cause of. We're a parasitical state. We live off the money of the entity. We have got to not stop doing that. We have got to wean ourselves off that dependency on that. And accept promises is a way to have our health and our environment and our ecology threatened. I'm going to finish with the last point. When the VX nerve gas proposal was made by the Army Corps of Engineers to come and allow DuPont to throw it into the river after it's neutralized, not fully, almost every scientist agreed it wouldn't be as much as an environmental impact as an ecological impact. It would kill the river. At the same time, a week after they came, before they came and made the presentation, I brought this up, they said, no longer should you eat 2 bluefish out of the river. Limit your consumption to 1 a year. When do we respond to our responsibility, to generations, to future generations, to our generations, to our children, our grandchildren, as opposed to the profit dollar? The only reason that industry ever wanted to come here involving the port from outside was at Kinder Morgan, when they wanted to bring in a pipeline, which would create no jobs once those pipes are sealed in place, which would create about 20 jobs and all. Everyone that fights for that type of economic revival is fighting against the natural needs of the citizens and the health of the state and the citizens of the state.
Ken?
A couple thoughts. One, I wanted to respond on the oil recycling example. That's one of only two examples that I know of where a permit was denied. The other one was the LNG terminal that they wanted to build in New Jersey. On that one, I was actually contacted, because I had written the article, I was contacted by the attorneys of Denrec, because there was a decision that had been made back in the 70s which said recycling of oil is the equivalent of refining oil, and oil refining is defined as heavy industry under the Act. Frankly, I was a little surprised when they used that rationale to say that's why we're not going to let you go to that site.
Can you call it a mini refinery?
Yeah, and you know, you can make an argument on that. But those are the only time, and my experience, and of course, you know, I represented the people who challenged the Tidewater, the Wandendale, you know, sewage treatment facility that Dick was talking about. You know, and from the perspective of many in the environmental community, Denrec is not exactly an attack dog when it comes to enforcing the Coastal Zone Act very strictly. And so, and, you know, and the other comment that I wanted to respond to was this idea of we don't even make the list because people say, oh, the Coastal Zone Act. And I think that's a function of education, right? I mean, if you tell people, well, look, you want to build a manufacturing facility? Totally allowed. Coastal Zone Act's not your problem. Let's clear up those misconceptions, and if that's really the issue, you know, then we can solve it that way. And I think on the Marcus Hook, which is the last thing, because I know that Molly Murray's article started with that, I think a couple of months ago when she wrote that article. Sunoco is, I think they would still qualify, a non-conforming use under the Act. Marcus Hook would be non-conforming use. So they can continue to do things on that site if they want to. And I think the reason why they aren't doing things on the Delaware side has nothing to do with the Coastal Zone Act, but has everything to do with the way Sunoco has decided as a business decision as to how they're going to process those fuels. And they said, we'll do it on the Pennsylvania side. But that's not the fault of the Act. That's Sunoco's business decision. And so to kind of try to point to those things and say it's the Coastal Zone Act's fault, I think is going too far.
I'm not sure, they may be outside that 2-year window, Ken. I don't know the facts on that, but that's my understanding. And let me just circle back around on one thing we said.
Quickly, we'll let Dick in.
Okay, I'm sorry. That this is, the conversation in the business community are about weakening the act in some general way or in a specified way. And I understand the concern that raises when you're talking about opening up the act for amendment, but I can tell you, as I said in my opening remarks, at least the conversations that I've been part of are all about Newcastle County north of the C&D Canal, only about grandfathered and abandoned sites, of which there may be a dozen, something like that. I don't know what the count is. So we're talking about enumerating specific sites that could take advantage of a coastal brownfield program if heavy industry were reintroduced. So you wouldn't be weakening the Coastal Zone Act, but you would be reapplying it to some specific sites. At least that's the conversations that I've been part of, and it's on that basis that I defend making some changes.
Dick?
The word port is mentioned.
4 or 5 times.
There's been a lot of discussion around, to me, that the Coastal Zone Act prohibits port construction. Let's look at the significance of the 20-acre definition what? The land area that the Coastal Zone Act talks about on the shore. The land under the water doesn't count. If what you're going to do is build a container port, and there are 4 sites being considered, one south of the canal, of the bridge. Another is the city of Wilmington Port brought around the corner onto the Delaware River rather than Christina. The third is the Cavour's site, and the 4th is the Claymont site. What you need for a container port is a crane runway. Crane runway needs to be 80 feet wide or less up to the edge of the dock. Okay? An 80-foot wide strip along the river for a container port has to be more than 2 miles long before it's bigger than 20 acres. That's the story. Any one of those 4 sites can handle a container port with an 80-foot wide runway, and you can make it narrower than 80 feet. Existing port doesn't have an 80-foot span grade. But the essence of it is it doesn't limit at all. There's no limitation under the Coastal Zone Act against the container port. That's all there is to that. Now then. There is a prohibition in the Act against activities that are prohibited by the Act that weren't already underway in 1971 when the Act became effective. That anyone would ever deliver oil by rail in quantities sufficient to operate a refinery. The Delaware City refinery is operating on oil delivered from the Northwest.
Actually, less so.
Yeah, because the world market is artificially screwed up by the Saudi Arabians to keep the price down so that it suppresses fracking. Anyhow, the refinery was given a coastal zone permit, or a subsidiary or related corporation was given the coastal zone permit to deliver the oil by rail.
Actually, it wasn't. They said they didn't do it.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And they didn't need a coastal zone permit. They said that, even though the Act requires a permit even for light industry. Okay. Denrec said they didn't need one. Okay. And even though the coastal zone regulation says that you must have offsets to any potential damage to the coastal zone due to malfunction of equipment. Your operation is absolutely perfect, except now and then something goes awry. You need to have offsets that are bigger than the amount of damage. The offsets don't have to be exercised at the site of the damage. They have to be somewhere in the coastal zone, but there must be offsets. However, the Secretary said, you don't need a permit, you don't need offsets. Perhaps somebody might suggest that Denrec read the Act.
I'm trying.
I know. I
I
tried to
couldn't
help.
raise the issue. I couldn't raise the issue.
I tried to help when I sat there, but there's also a coastal zone regulation. And anytime somebody talks about modification of the Coastal Zone Act, the question ought to arise whether the change that you contemplate is something that can be achieved merely by revising the regulation.
I think you're right.
The regulation has to be written by DEMREC, as it was, nearly 30 years after the act was adopted. And the existing regulation was adopted on my motion before by the Coastal Zone Industrial Control Board when I was a member. And it was much against the desire of the chairman who wanted to table it a few more years. But I made the argument that if we tabled it, our grandchildren would have grandchildren before it gets back into consideration. This is the best we can come up with. We better adopt it and improve it as we go along. We haven't improved it as we've gone along. There was one modification in 2001 to recognize something that was inherent in the act anyhow, that you couldn't prohibit a government-owned sewage treatment plant. It was written into the regulation because of court suit. In any event, the regulation does need work. It can be fixed by DENREC's initiative if they bother to read it and read the act. And all that it requires for it to be adopted is approval by the Coastal Zone Industrial Control Board. Now, my perception when I was a member was that it was very difficult to wake up any of the other members. But, you know, I'm kind of prejudiced about it.
I wasn't going to say anything.
Kenny knows about that.
Well,
Let me just
go
respond
ahead.
real quick on this, just to kind of agree with Victor, because I think there is some interest in maybe starting a process between the business community and the environmental community, and broader, to look at the coastal zone regulations. But I still think that if we're going to allow heavy industry above and beyond the 20-acre loophole in on those grandfathered sites, that they would take an amendment of the act to get that done. I don't think you can do that in regulation. So it's been talked about, and certainly no decision made. I think there was kind of a sense that you had to amend the act, and it might be worth taking a look at the regulations. Because I think everyone kind of that works with them finds that there are fuzzy spots and they can be misinterpreted. So I think there would be some interest in having that conversation.
I just want to follow up on that, the legal part of that, what was stated here, bandied about here. Certainly, there are a lot of regulations that can be affected or disaffected by DEMREC decisions. And I'm one that does not have a lot of faith in some of those decisions when they change regulation. And certainly, it is our God-given right as lawmakers to deny a regulation that violates an act. And that has to be obvious. That still leaves a lot of room for mischievous behaviors. So if you want to change regulations, or you're suggesting that regulations be changed, and you're going to have a very, very receptive ear in DENREC, believe me, then try that, propose that, but don't presume that we have to affect or disaffect or change the Coastal Zone Protection Act. That's a turnabout. That is the wrong way to do it. That's taking the foundation of a building and saying, I'm going to replace that foundation of that building before I decide to add another floor or make another floor. You cannot do it backwards like that. It shouldn't be done backwards like that.
Well, you both hit on opposite sides of what was put down as the second question. Should the act be modified to continue heavy industrial operations on sites once heavy industry in the zone, but which are now shuttered. And similarly, how many such parcels exist? You've got General Chem, you've got Claymont, you've got Medichem, and Chenica,
I think it's
Chemical.
like a dozen or 14.
Okay,
Oceanport, there
and-
there are other places.
The other thing that comes to mind, if there was consideration, and this is to you, Paul, if there was consideration to go in and modify the act so that it made it more receptive for other sites to be available, seeing that we have so many sites that have been closed up, shut down, and nobody ever cleaned up the problem, you referred to one that's $300 million to address one of those sites. And the fact that Delaware is the capital of LLCs in the world, why would we invite somebody else in to a different site to create another problem that Delaware is going to have to deal with further down the line?
Well, I'm out of my depth here in terms of the legal side of things, but I don't think it's easy anymore. I think laws have changed. I don't think it's easy anymore to create a legacy polluted site and walk away. I don't think that's a common occurrence. I think that's hard to do.
I can point
I
to
know
two
this-
of them.
I know this is, and I live in Delaware City, so I'm fully aware of it. But I think those days are gone. I don't, even with LLCs, I don't think that's the real threat. And as for, how many of these sites are, I don't know the number of parcels, but the sites are probably a dozen, 14, something like that. And not all of them not all of them can be worked on. I agree with that. All we're saying is that there's some that could be, that could attract investment and could be restored, and it's why preclude that is all that's our only point. And we're not talking about additional sites. I don't think anyone's.
Oh, you're talking that you would modify the act only to address the
Only to address
past
those past.
industrial sites.
Yeah, the grandfathered or abandoned sites. That's all anyone's talking about that I'm aware of.
Well, I think, I think the release question too said, it says, should the act be modified to continue quote unquote heavy industrial operations on sites once grandfathered? That's key to this dialogue we're having here. As is pointed out, manufacturing sites are, uses not in existence in active use on June 28th are allowed, but only by permit. When we look at that, we look at the almost contradiction in terms, and then we talk about, and with all due respect, and I certainly know the business community isn't necessarily wanting to run unfettered, although you might take it from my perspective. But the days are gone. You don't need an LLC. All you need is DuPont to sell an entity to a company they create called Kim Moore's. And now you have locked in a $300 million cleanup site that no one's going to be responsible for. It's even more invasive than LLCs. If we ever reform the LLC laws like we should, then we'll be able to capture the person who is ultimately responsible. But this is in corporation laws too that are at fault here. And that was only a mere year and a half ago that this happened. And in our angst to say we want investment money, we turn a blind eye to DuPont laying off 1,700 employees. At the same time, they spun off, due to the merger, potential merger with them, spun off the Pioneer Seeds Company, which shut down all production of the remake of the facility over here in Newark, and is now in Iowa. So they kept 30 jobs here, 40 jobs here at headquarters, with all the wonderful appropriate tax breaks that we give corporations for having headquarters here. At the same time, they moved 300 jobs to Iowa for the Pioneer Seeds Research Development Plant. It is time to wrest back the control of our economy from the duplicitous nature of some of the corporations.
But John, that cleanup liability hasn't gone away from Chemours. I mean, Chemours is still on the hook for that. I can give you one example from the Delaware City. I'm the city manager for one, so I'm familiar with it. There is a plume under the refinery that down gradient toward Dragon Run, that beautiful, pristine place. And when Motiva sold the refinery to Premcor, or whoever it was, prior to PBF, Motiva retained liability for that cleanup, and they're cleaning it. They're pumping and they're putting bugs in the ground and all that sort of stuff, and presumably are having some success. But they're on the hook for that, and I know that's costing them a fair amount of money, and they have not owned the refinery for, what, 15 years?
Well, I worked there for 25 years. I went through Getty, Motiva, Premcor, every iteration.
I know.
And about halfway through my career there, I spent 25 years down there. They told us we had the water test. The water's not the water. And then they said, well, everything's okay, but then they decided to test it. And in a 5-mile radius of that area, all the groundwater is contaminated. So they started bringing in bottled water. But now what was the recourse? During the cleanup to the residents in that area. The residents had wells. What was the recourse to the people that were already affected by it? When I first moved to Delaware, took my job at that refinery, and I said, I'll go down there. My wife said, look at this paper. There's that circle, bullseye. 5-mile radius around the refinery, which a lot of it was Formosa and other industries that actually I think still exist, but some of them were shuttered down. And it said, if you work or live in this area, go get a brain scan or whatever the test is to make sure you don't have a developing brain cancer, because the incidence of brain cancer was so high. I'm not talking about willingness to remedy situations. I am talking about that in the context of that. I haven't seen anybody stepping up and saying, here, let me put out the $300 million to fix that thing. It may be an obligation that Chemours has. I don't know how to change what they sell that site.
So that's the state.
You know, so the obligation for recovery of taxpayer money when we have to do something to remedy the situation, to preserve and protect the health of the citizens, shouldn't fall on the taxpayers.
It shouldn't.
It shouldn't
We
fall
agree.
on those corporations, and they're not willing to step up when they own it. Why would I expect them to step up coming in? I don't have that faith in the corporate community. I don't have it, and I think I'm justified in not having it. They haven't proved to me any aptitude or any attitude or any commitment to doing the investment that they need to protect the health of the people, as long as it interferes with their basic ability to get as much profit out of an enterprise as they can.
Conveyance of environmental liability is an everyday occurrence in commercial real estate. I mean, it could be an old dry cleaner site. It's just, it's an
But does
everyday
that make
thing.
it right?
Well, I'm saying that one of the parties is always responsible.
Then I wanna know
Either they're
wait,
assuming that environmental liability, or they're.
I just want to answer this question with one prime example. 12 years ago, when I was running for office, I got a debris pit commitment cleanup site, taxpayer expense, on the Anvil Park, North Hunter Forge Road. And when they said, we don't have the money in that, but we're going to try to put together this place, because they've been waiting a long time. They finally got into the debris pit remediation. It took $2 million. So I said, why can't we recover that from who put that debris pit there? They said, it was Magnus Construction. Magnus Construction. Built cheapest house you could buy was $500,000 in Academy Hills. Built, put this debris pit there. 2 homes were sinking into it. We got that remedy, $2 million cost. And I said, why don't we recover it? Oh, because they sold that property to Magnus Bakery, and Magnus Bakery's out of existence now. Don't tell me about responsibility being a burden on businesses. Businesses do not live up to their burden of their responsibility. Not all businesses, but most businesses don't. And I suggest that that's a true story. That's an account that happened. You know, paying $2 million, the taxpayers paid $2 million.
Yeah, there is
And we haven't recovered it yet.
a deep pit fund for that reason. There's no question about that. It does happen. I overstated the case, but that's the
I didn't mean to be
exception.
angry about it.
But I think that's
when I
the
see those things
exception
happening,
rather than the
it
rule.
discourages
Asbestos
me.
companies, they've never paid up. I'm sorry, they have not paid up to asbestos companies. They sold and sold and sold and sold it down the river for a pittance, bought those companies for a pittance, and they never supported the people who died of asbestosis. And they're still dying.
Legacy. Yeah.
Paul, what makes you think that there's been a change in behavior under companies that file under the LLCs that is dramatically different from the behaviors expected? You implied earlier that you think there's much more responsibility than there might have been previously under other LLCs, and that they're much more environmentally and civically aware.
Well, no, I didn't make that statement,
You did, but you were implying
I think the state of the law,
Inferring
no, I think the state of the law and enforcement has changed, whereby the practices that happened in the past with legacy pollution before environmental laws came into being, that's just an outlier today. I just don't think that's that common.
Actually, I think of a recent.
Can we have the other members
Yeah,
answer question
yeah.
two?
Yeah, I'm
I'd
sorry.
like to hear a
Jim,
few more.
why don't you jump in on any point that you'd like to make?
Well, I think as far as the state of the current laws, I think the point that Paul was making is there's a lot more environmental controls in place now than when the act was implemented. And so, the problems we saw at the refinery are there's a lot of things that they need to put into place in the front end when they set up operations that weren't there before. And I think Professor Crystal can probably elucidate the changes in the law that have happened in the last 45 years.
Certainly since 1971,
Yeah. So you're not going to have the same situations. There can be situations that would develop, but there are a lot more controls in place at the front end.
Couldn't we look at what has transpired over the 40-plus years that it's been in effect, and having some constraints over reuse of properties or redevelopment of some of those properties for industrial purposes? I'm got stuck in my head the fact that we've got so many sites that are heavily polluted. Paul alluded to the one that's $300 million to potentially clean up that nobody would be interested in. So what do you think the law has done and would allow, how we might benefit in the future by taking some of that regulation or oversight away?
I think part of the reason why we don't have a line of people lined up to take over these sites here in Delaware is because there's a whole lot of them in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland that don't have to deal with the Coastal Zone Act. So, they're going to go to wherever it's easiest to operate. And, it may be just perception of the coastal zone that's preventing them from looking seriously at Delaware. I can't say because I'm not one of those people that's looking to develop a site, but it's not helping us at this point. It is so much easier. DuPont has sites, industrial sites that they've abandoned on the other side of the river in New Jersey that are up for sale. And those are actively being redeveloped. I can't say why they aren't coming here, but I don't think the perception of the coastal zone is helping us. And I think this is something that we should have a civil conversation over, because the point I made earlier, if we keep the act exactly as it is, we'll lose the coastal zone. We need to figure out something. I don't have the answer, but I think there's enough brain power in this room that we can start looking at what we can do to bring in the revenue we need in order to pay for the cleanups that we need to do and to either stabilize the zone or work on some kind of a plan to retreat. Okay.
Part of the problem that we have is that organizations like the State Chamber of Commerce don't go out and say what you can do under the Coastal Zone Act. They go out and say you can't do something under the Coastal Zone Act. So what you can't do is a figment of their imagination and their refusal to read the act and the regulation.
It's not just the Chamber of Commerce, it's also all the realtors that are out there working on selling industrial
So
sites.
perhaps what we need is our veto folks understanding what the act says and teaching people that their imaginations have gone wild, and they believe things that aren't so.
You're saying
Department of
that they're
Economic
creating an
Yeah.
artificial, you know,
They have
burden
a set of
on
imaginary
industry that
horribles
really isn't there.
that they use to unsell Delaware, or to sell it to,
Force a change.
to folks that declare that, that the little electric generators that burn natural gas aren't good.
Can I just,
Please do.
I understand Jim's point, but I'm very concerned about the idea that Pennsylvania or New Jersey or Maryland or some other local state gets business and we don't. And the reason is the coastal zone. Okay, because remember the Coastal Zone Act covers a 2-mile strip that runs along the coast. All right? That's a small percentage of Newcastle County. So if someone says, I really want to come to Delaware, but that damn Coastal Zone Act is in the way, there's a lot of other places where they could build, right? And the flip side of it is that Pennsylvania and Maryland, you know, they don't have the same kind of sort of resources and availability. So I think it's really hard, and I think it's dangerous to say, we've got a coastal zone act, they don't, so it's the coastal zone act's fault. And I think that's, I think the conversation is a good idea. You know, in 1999, when the regulations were done, there was a process set up. I think it was Governor Crocker, right? Who set it up, and you had stakeholders from all the different things, and they sat in a room and they hammered out what those regulations should be. And I think that is a good process to have a conversation like what Jim's proposing. I think that's a great idea. I think we can talk some of these things through. But you know, if I was selected to be part of that conversation, I would come in with a certain amount of skepticism and say, you know, I'm certainly open to being persuaded to lots of things. Right? But, you know, and I think it's real easy to say, you know, if we can get rid of that regulation, then everything will be great.
So you're arguing to maintain the act and reconsider some of the regulations that are implemented because of the act?
No, I'm saying that I think it can be worthwhile to have a conversation, because I'd really like to hear what is it about the act that is so problematic, because I can't see it.
Being specific.
And then, when we got that, then we can say, okay, well, is that a real issue? Is it not? Does it need some kind of a change? Or is it, let's get the Chamber of Commerce to understand what the act really is. Let's figure out a solution. But the concern, and frankly, Paul, what I hear you saying is less alarming to me if you're talking about there's 14 sites, let's talk about 14 sites, then let's change the act, which is what the environmental community.
That's why we need to have this conversation. That's exactly.
Because that's scary. That's scary. There are lots of good things here. And, you know, certainly a conversation is a good idea. Whether or not it results in anything, I don't know.
I'm kind of thinking we might want to start wrapping it up. Do we want to start with John and just kind of come down, everybody get one last opportunity to
Okay, I'll try to make it brief. I understand, and I think this conversation is helpful, but I think that any conversation about the regulations that are overbearing, I mean, I could point regulations in the state that are crushing the business, and not many of them are involved in the Coastal Zone Act, but when I refer, and I remember this article, when this article came out, Delaware Chamber of Commerce and Rich Hebron wanted to relax the act and redefine what heavy industry is in the zone. That's a far cry from a looking at regulations as to the this effect that they have, not only on the economy, but on everything else. When we start talking in narrow terms like that, I see it as an impetus, a push by corporatists who are not at all caring about the residue they leave after they exit, who are not caring about the disaster they can create when they enter. That is what's important to me. It's always going to be important to me as a lawmaker in the state, because I will never let that go unchallenged, that kind of attitude. And that seems to be the attitude that permeates, that somehow there would be a flock of people coming here, somehow we would be able to redefine our coastal zone woes, but if we allowed heavy industry to be built on them. These are all really convoluted opinions and conclusions that have no basis in fact. And I don't think I want to entertain that discussion of that at that level, because that's a foregone conclusion there. We should just reduce the act and people are going to come, build it and they'll come. That's not true. That's all.
Paul?
I think we just look at a limited number of sites in Newcastle County, north of the Seaweed Canal, that were grandfathered and have been abandoned, and they're sitting there vacant. Many of them contain contaminants and represent an environmental hazard, and yet they're not providing any economic benefit either. So we're looking at the worst of both worlds, in my opinion. So if the state of Delaware can't intelligently look at 14 sites and figure out how to make it either more productive or get them cleaned up without the public having to pay for it, then we ought to give up. I mean, it just makes no sense to me to leave things in limbo the way they are. And I think with targeted changes, we can bring those properties back to be a competitive part of our economy and be an environmental, be cleaner as well. So that's all we're looking at, is that conundrum of having these vacant sites that are in an attractive location that aren't doing anybody any good and are polluted.
And you'll look at which ones are under 28.
Well, I have a feeling that some people are going to start looking at that. Frankly, it never occurred to me. I don't know, but I don't know that that's important. It just seems to be more reasonable to us to take a look at what changes could be made to make those productive properties. That's all there is to it. And as for in terms of industrial sites in Newcastle County, I'll look at Nancy and ask what she thinks the odds of getting a property rezoned for heavy industry in Newcastle County would be today. And I think the answer would be slim to none. And so outside of Boxwood, these sites along the river are what Newcastle County has. So there aren't a lot of options.
Still a few more.
And not heard none. We looked at those.
One in
but I
Washington,
ain't-
a couple in Delaware.
Yeah.
We done that. Victor,
Well,
closing comment.
I have to say, I was not a liberal arts. I'm an engineer, friendly neighborhood rocket scientist. Numbers are very important. I know a lot of liberal arts folks where numbers are unholy and they stay as far away from them as they can. We have a lot of sites that are potential for development, but have hazards that need to be taken care of, existing hazards that need to be taken care of. Somebody needs to put a price tag on how much money is involved with cleaning up each such site, and then try to peddle it to somebody who's willing to sign up for that site for the dubious glory of building a plant in Delaware. Without that, they're talking through their hats. It's all nonsense, imaginary. Okay? And you might as well tell them to shut up until they find out what they're talking about.
Okay, I guess it's time to tell you to shut up like Ken.
I think the act is a very unique and special piece of legislation that has, remember, it was designed originally, it was driven by the fact that Shell wanted to build another refinery. That refinery was never built because of the act. It's had some successes. It has done some good things. But I'm certainly willing to have a conversation, I think, to see if there really are these people who want it. Because I think if there aren't, I don't see any reason to change the act. If there are, I don't know. I'd be willing to have a conversation to find out what people would be willing to do in trying to make these 14 sites work. But my feeling is, the act does good things and we should tread carefully. That's what I think would be certainly my approach towards any kind of conversation about it. I'm heartened by the fact, frankly, that Paul has a much more limited view than what I feared was what the business community wanted. So let's have the conversation. Let's see where it could go. Maybe we can build in the kinds of things that Jim says are important. Maybe you can find a way that for these 14 sites, if we build in these protections, maybe it's worth doing. All right? We've got to have that conversation, and I think that's a good idea for all of us.
Jim, before you get your closing comment, the one thing that comes to mind is when there was dredging to widen the canal or deepen the canal, we could have pumped that dirt or that soil on the Delaware side of the river and built up a mound. It was a greater protection for the coastal areas that exist. So if worse comes to worse, we can always pump artificial island across the river and spread it out. Anyhow, you're here to live the last word.
The argument of the broadkill.
Yeah. I'm really happy that everyone is considering having a broader conversation, because I think that's what we really need to do. Because it's more than just looking at these industrial sites, which are all that we're looking at developing. We need to look at the coastal zone, and what does it need for us to protect it and save it? Because sea level rise and storm surges are going to wash it away, and we need to look at what will it cost in order to preserve what we have, because from a natural standpoint, it is the greatest asset that Delaware has, and it's something that no other states in the East Coast have. People come from all over the world to our coastal zone, and that's something that has an economic value on its own. So we need to marry the two concerns. We need to see what the coastal zone needs to really protect it from the things that aren't well, that too. But we need to see what we need to do in order to save the coastal zone and preserve it as close to, we're not going to stop sea level rise, but we can mitigate it to a certain extent, and we need to explore ways of doing that and put a price tag on it. And then if we can use the redevelopment to generate some revenue to then help to fund that, because the state, just from what John was saying, is very accurate. The state is not in an economic condition where it's going to be able to spend that money in order to preserve our natural resource. And so we need to look at other ways of doing that. And the conversation around targeted redevelopment in the coastal zone could generate some revenue in order to do that. I don't know if we can reach an agreement on that, but it's worth exploring.
Not to interrupt, but it may be a question for the audience we can take, but also this, Vic has always talked about the offsets, and that DENREC never properly wrote a formula for offsets. But at any rate, and you're talking about raising revenue, it is through this offset process?
Right, but we'd have to target the offsets, because currently the offsets, they go into some nebulous account that I don't know how they figure out where the offset is, but somehow they agree on some amount of money that needs to be spent.
Usually it's not money. usually it's not money, usually it's, oh, we're gonna have X number of tons of nitrous oxide.
Yeah.
And they go to
Eliminate.
Dito, and Dito
Yeah.
gives them some credits, and that's how they offset.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because Dito gets 25% of all the offsets that are generated
Oh,
in
okay.
the state, so
Oh,
they
that's
hand it
right.
out like Halloween.
So if we can work that out so that it actually does projects in the coastal zone, I think we'd all benefit.
That's a good place to start.
I think there'd be interest on both sides of that.
I know Stephanie Heron's been sticking her arm up for the past half hour off and on. I was gonna try to wrap it up, but go ahead.
Yeah, it takes the budget.
We'll just be super quick, but I'm very confused about the argument that you're making, Mr. Black, which is the coastal zone is going, I mean, multiple of your arguments, but specifically the most recent one that you just made a minute ago. The coastal zone is going into the sea, which is, I think we can all agree on that. I mean,
Yeah.
like 100% of scientists agree on that. So we can get some big polluters to come pollute the air in that area for like a couple of years, and then they'll just be cool with it washing under the ocean. I mean, like, I don't understand. The argument that you just made seems ridiculous to me, in that it just doesn't make sense to me logically. And again, I was a liberal arts major. I'm no engineer. I was an English major. So, but just from like a language standpoint and just like common sense standpoint, the argument that these sites are literally going under the ocean and we need to protect them, which I don't think anyone disagrees with, and they're obviously one of the biggest assets we have economically in the state. So I just don't understand what you mean by like they're going underwater anyway, so why don't we try to attract some industry to go like redevelop them, like in the interim, in the
Okay,
meantime?
I think you misunderstood what I was talking about. I'm not talking about those 12 or 14 sites going underwater. I'm talking about the entire coastal zone.
I thought you were
being
only
inundated.
talking about the existing sites
No, I'm
that are
talking about
in
the
Newcastle
entire
County above the
coastal
canal.
zone is being inundated.
Yeah.
And all I'm talking about is on the redevelopment side, is that could be a source of revenue, because if you have industry coming in, spending money to set up industries on those grandfather, the existing brownfield sites that we would designate, that then they would provide revenue that could be used to do whatever mitigation we decide needs to be done to preserve the coastal zone.
So you're saying by loosening the coastal zone, we put a new regulation in that says some of that money's gotta go back to protect the rest of the
Well,
coast?
no, they have to do offsets currently, and yes, we could have an additional requirement that they put money into a fund, in order to get this moving. And it's all hypothetical at this point, because like everybody has said, there isn't anybody knocking at the door currently.
Yes.
I'm Stan. Hi, I'm Brett Sadler at University of Claymont Renaissance Development Incorporated. Our job is to revitalize Claymont. I basically work for the residents in Claymont. And by the way, I think we have a good portion of these sites. 5 are in Jamores, getting out of Claymont 6. Our organization has not taken a stand on this, but I'll tell you what I do know. I do know 2 things. One is visit with Sunoco Logistics, seeing a map of what they plan on doing after their cracker facility. It has a more technical term, but basically taking natural gas liquids, breaking it down into its various components and everything. So their goal up there is to have set up, basically, I'm simplifying this clearly because I'm not an engineer or an environmental engineer. Basically, taking the natural gas liquids, breaking it down into its various components, and selling off or leasing off pad sites on that site. They only need a small portion of the book facility for storage and export. So on those pad sites, they were talking about manufacturing jobs. There's 2 things on that site. There's energy being generated on that site, and there's also the raw materials. 2 of the most expensive things comes with manufacturing. So the potential for job creation on the Claymont Steel site is huge, both in Hook and in Claymont. the site next to that is a General Chemical site, I mentioned before. We had a gentleman who I've gotten to know recently who spent a lot of time and money and effort going after the defunct General Chemical site, it's owned by a Canadian firm, who did not want to sell this site. It was more like, it is so toxic, they wanted to let lying dogs lie, just pay their taxes, and just nothing to see here. And it is pretty bad. I wanted to throw my shoes out the car window after taking a tour of it. Could have been smoking. So they're looking at what's happening at Sunoco and investing in the future. All that effort going after that site, believe it or not, they can capitalize on what's happening at Sunoco and create value for that site. So there is things happening. Now, we have the Claymont Steel site. Of course, we have Lindy, which is a $100 million investment they just announced. There's the Oceanport site. We have the Claymont Steel site. So we got a lot of industry up there. I can tell you all one thing, everybody in this room. I haven't worked for the last 16 or more years to create a toxic wasteland that people are not going to want to move or invest in Claymont. So that's not going to happen. So the jury is still out. I do like what I'm hearing, though, of maybe not changing the act, but going in and looking at specific regulations. A very quick point, General Chemical site. They would like to have multiple users for a pier. They have a pier that was built during the Roosevelt administration. And under the coastal zone, a pier can only have one user, which is not a good business model for them. They would like to have 3 different users for that pier. Auxiliary user for Sunoco Logistics. They were talking to a bulk transfer of palm oil. Something that's not, you think of bulk transfer, you think of like coal being poured out, but this is something that they can't do, it's just considered bulk transfer. So these are the little things, not little things, big things, that need to be looked at. How can we get these sites working again? Because I've knocked on a lot of doors working for a million times, we're not a partisan organization, with various elected officials meeting folks who had those manufacturing jobs, making good money at Claymont Steel, and my grandfather worked for Sunoco and General Chemical. Those jobs are not there. So we have a chance to bring some of those manufacturing jobs back. Maybe not for these guys who are, stirring pain at Home Depot, but maybe for their kids who are not going to be working in the, the corner office with the tie. So we need to back.
Connie?
We have a response
Let me
from our
ask you a
audience.
question.
Sorry.
You started out talking about LNG, liquid natural gas.
Natural gas liquids. I was corrected by Sunoco gas liquids.
Natural, okay. Yeah, liquids that are made out of natural gas. You see, some years ago, we went for the bit with the proposal to put an LNG plant to receive LNG.
Eagles Point, right, I remember.
Across the river from you folks. And it was a small technicality that killed that, actually.
I remember.
But the issue was that there was testimony, not testimony, there were documents in the record that talked about the potential size of a fireball if a fully loaded tanker ship went up in the channel. Thank you. And the testimony or the documents didn't make clear whether they were talking about radius or diameter, but they talked about a mile. And the river's 4,000 feet wide there. And so the underlying issue was how much liability insurance is the operator of the LNG facility going to carry?
I'm not a safety engineer. That was a question brought up. We had a public meeting about 2 years ago when they started moving ahead, two and a half years ago at the Oak plant. Big turnout in Claymont. Probably had about 250 or more people there, which I was happy about. It's a little different process. It's a safer process, even with their tankers for export. I think they just recently did their first delivery to Scotland, I think, on a specialized tanker that's it's basically a refrigerated tanker. I'm not an expert in this, so if I get something wrong, please forgive me. Nothing is is risk-free. And if someone who's lived through a big boom at Sunoco about a decade ago, scared the hell out of me when
You'll love it, LNG.
oh, yeah. But anyway, I don't have all those answers, but.
We didn't reach that issue on the LNG facility. We defeated that, or we rejected that on a technicality.
Well, Vic, right now, those tankers, there's nothing Delaware can do, because those tankers are being filled up in Hook
Exactly.
and going down the river, so that's sort of
Exactly.
moot
But the
for us, though.
question needs to be asked, who is the one, who pays for what happens if the tanker goes up and burns a quarter mile of the onshore?
Or if it goes up under a bridge.
Yeah, that too.
If it goes up on a bridge, I remember that dialogue, and that mile that you're talking about is a fireball radius. The
Radius.
devastation goes beyond the mile.
Can't we put a rubber tarp over it? I mean, it's big in Delaware. I'm at no piece,
Technicality
Go ahead.
involved.
Go ahead.
The technicality
Quickly.
involved that defeated that was whether the offshore unloading facility was ancillary to an onshore manufacturing facility that was lawful, or whether the onshore manufacturing facility was ancillary to the offshore unloading facility.
Bill, sorry, I gotta throw one last thing in, I'm sorry, over my time. What I was getting at, and I didn't get that, was when I was up at Sunoco's, I saw a map of the proposed plant. They had a line of, you saw the arc of the state of Delaware, and I said, well, why is the state Delaware portion of Sunoco plant grayed out? And the answer I got from them was, and they weren't trying to, I'm nobody, so they weren't trying to persuade me in some sort of way, that they can't get anybody interested in looking at Delaware. So it's a perception issue, and trust me, my job is Claymont, I know perception issues.
I think we covered that earlier.
So,
And there's an argument to say somebody's fashioned the perception. Connie, then I'll get to you.
Okay, I'm not an engineer or a, English major, I'm a psychologist and a psychology major. And I have to say, I'm always impressed with the business community's ability to morph the argument into, we really want to help you and clean things up. If you want to use those zones, my suggestion is to do exactly what Vic said. Present an option for an area that you have, that you want to clean up, that you want to put something on, and we can have a conversation there for what you want to do for a specific area that you want to put a plant on. As far as the Coastal Zone Act, I am really not interested at all. And the only thing I disagreed with you the entire night, because I love you. The only thing I disagreed with you was when you said, yeah, let's have a conversation. No, I'm not interested in the state having a conversation with the chamber. Because I've found my experience when you have those kind of conversations is that it usually ends up in some kind of strange compromise, and it is worse for the people, never better. I've never found that to be the case, that it ends up being better for the people. It's better for corporations and the chamber. They have a lot more power than the people. It doesn't end up being better. I totally agree with what Vic said. There you go. You have these things, go with it, say what you want to do with it, that's where the conversation is. And my feeling is, that's where the conversation should stop.
Gentleman in the back.
My name is Martin Willis. In 1999, the regulations governing the Delaware Coastal Zone came into effect. In Appendix C of those regulations says that the regulations ought to be revisited biannually. Since 1999, there hasn't been any stakeholders from the state of Delaware to revisit the act. Things have changed dramatically since 1999. As you said, sir, 7 out of the 14 grandfathered sites, if you go on Delaware's Coastal Zone Act program, you'll see 7 of the 14 footprints are now industrial graveyards. we need to have a conversation again about changing the regulations. The regulations are outdated, they need to be modern and put up to date. We need to have the stakeholders come together again and look over the regulations. That's all we're asking for. As you said, sir, about the LNG plant, I was heavily involved in that. BP wanted to build a pier into the Delaware River, 1,000 feet from Keystone Coal's pier. In 1991, Keystone asked for a Coastal Zone Act permit. The environmentalists said, if you give us took a settlement of $670,000, they got the pier. The reason the pier did not, for BP did not go in, because they were not going to manufacture anything. If they had put a power plant on the end of like Keystone did, they would have got the pier. I was born and raised here in Delaware. In 1971, I started school. The Coastal Zone Act is the foundation of all environmental laws here in the state of Delaware. Nobody that I know of wants to change the act. We just want to improve on the regulations.
I got a question.
And I got just one more thing, please.
Yes, quick.
Okay, one more thing. I've worked in the BP, in the Sunoco plant. If you step on this side in the Pennsylvania, there's $3.5 billion for work. On this side in Delaware, 40 acres they have in Delaware, there's nothing. It's a shame. They could put $1 billion worth of work, up to $14 billion worth of work in the state of Delaware. The state of Delaware's budget is only $4 billion.
I wanted to ask you a question, and I got a fair understanding as the point you're making. There's 14 sites, 7 of them are vacant and not being used.
Yes.
Every single one of them has left an environmental problem behind for somebody else to deal with.
And
Before we consider doing something with those sites,
Clean it up.
shouldn't we be able to say, since we couldn't hold these people liable, why should we expect the next guy coming down the block to be any better stored than
that's
Credit?
one of the reasons is this, okay? The proximity to the Delaware River.
It got closer since
Can I finish?
1971.
Excuse me, can I finish? Okay. The General Chemical plant closed in 2000. In 2003, an ethanol plant wanted to come into that site. No, you cannot do it because of Coastal Zone Act. Since 2000, when the plant closed down, only thing that's grown there is weed. Nobody's coming there to invest in it. Now, since Sunoco, with the development of natural gas, wants to come, they're running out of room. They're spending so much money putting pipelines in close to the pier, close to the river. They could expand across Route 13, but it costs so much money to put in the pipeline. Every single union local out of Philadelphia has a manning shortage. We have half the locals here in Delaware are going across the state line to work in Pennsylvania. Only thing we're asking is to redevelop these brownfields that have become industrial graveyards. The Coastal Zone Act is more of a land use statute than it is an environmental one. Only thing we want to do is use the land for its use.
Can you let Matt have a chance to ask a question?
I'm Matt Del Pizzo. I'm president of Delaware Audubon Society. This is kind of like deja vu. We have these conversations like every 10 to 20 years. And the moment it was made a law and it was enacted was the first day the business community was going to attack it and kill it. It would have been good if you're going to have this forum and you made everybody read the act before they got here. Instead of saying superfluous, kind of really dumb things if you're going to be behind it. And the business community can come help the environmentalists when we're fighting to get more and more work with good scrubber technology
Or cooling towers.
at the refinery
Or
that
cooling
gives them
towers.
tens of millions of
Yeah.
dollars more than the business people fight against all the time. So anytime you want to come to a meeting, Paul, because I know Delaware City's always fought anything good at the refinery. That's business. That's money. Listen, Delaware's in a lot of bad shape. It's like CTD, they call it, when you're in a hospital, circling the drain. So you're going down the drain, you reach up to the coastal zone. That's holding this all back. There's global impact here. We reopened a refinery with taxpayer money in the coastal zone. It's making a fortune. That didn't stop anything. Fisker came here, lost their butt. That didn't stop anything. And we're giving money for those things. So, how about taking that money, clean up the sites?
Who would they do it?
Hold on.
How'd they do it?
Hold on. Let's do something unique in Delaware and start cleaning up the sites. Clean up the sites, that's revenue that's created. Then at that point, maybe it's possibly functional that somebody will want to take that over instead of industrial graveyard like Edgemore. We're stuck with that. With a rubber tarp over it. Start throwing your trash out to the back of your yard, see how long that lasts. So there's two sets of rules here. So these are hobgoblins being created. Coastal Zone's not stopping anybody. Middletown had a manufacturing thing go in today in the paper. Who
Do
stopped
you have a
that?
question for anybody on the panel, or
Hey, people are coming to Delaware.
One more thing.
anybody
One more
want to
thing.
chime
Can I say
in?
one more thing?
It's
Yeah.
a dump,
Can I say one more
Martin.
thing? Can I say one
Martin,
more
it's a
thing?
dump.
Can I say one more thing?
Sorry.
City Steel, right?
We gotta wrap this up.
Can I say one more thing? City
Actually,
Steel,
we do have,
the Phoenix Steel site,
yes.
the west side, that's in the that's not in the Coastal Zone Act. The east side is in the Coastal Zone Act. It's kind of crazy that one side of this plant is in the Coastal Zone Act and the other side is not. It doesn't make any sense to me. Like everybody says, the Coastal Zone Act is 2 miles wide, not in northern Newcastle, Delaware.
Any further comments?
Yeah, I just want to make one comment when we talk about commitment and money. When we were engaged in the dialogue, I called for about a year and a half, 2 years, about bringing offshore wind and the resources involved, and one of the competitors was NRG, Indian River operator. And I'll be honest with you, the laborers approached me, and Sam Latham approached me and said, you know, there's a lot of jobs there. I mean, if we don't allow them to build, then at the time it's going to be I believe a coal fire plant extension of that, but it might have been natural gas. But at the same time, they had been advised by the EPA that they should address the scrubber project on the existing coal fire plant, which they since have converted to natural gas to avoid that. And I said to my friends, and they're my friends, to Brian McGlinchey and Sam Layton, I said, why aren't you sitting on their doorstep and saying, due to and I had the price tag for it, $300 million worth of jobs to put the scrubber on. Do that, and you can assuage the fact that people are sitting on benches unemployed. Do that first. And then they came back and said to me, if you'll support us against the offshore wind, we'll do that. We'll commit to that. Because our plan will be then to close that down in 5 years. That section that they did $300 million in to open up their new entity, their new generation capacity. And I said, well, let me put myself in the position of this. And you probably know the gentleman who was there long. I said, Mike Houghton. And he had two of the vice presidents. And I said, let me put myself in a position. I'm going to put my hat on. I'm a shareholder. I'm a stockholder in your company. I'm not, but just for a moment. I said, you can tell me you're going to put $300 million of my money into investing into this. You're going to close it down after 5 years. So you can capture this generation capacity that is looking at you with enticing eyes of economic thing. That is what the honesty issue comes into. That is what intellectual honesty comes into. I'm not accusing anybody of being intellectually dishonest, but there are people out there that are intellectually dishonest. And the fact is that it's driven by a need, by a desire to maximize profit, regardless of how much it maximizes damage. That's one thing that I feel is my obligation to protect against. I'm a 37-year human. I worked at the refinery for 25 years. I am not ashamed of how hard I worked. I'm ashamed that some of the things that happened down there weren't addressed more, I guess, excitedly, by my counterparts. But I made a good living down there. And you just asked me, did I feel that reopening that refinery was the proper thing to do? And I had to be honest. I had to weigh that against the consequences of so many jobs leaving in a state that has been suffering the manufacturing. I'm not proud of being partially hypocritical. I am proud of the fact that I can weigh the economic consequences, which would be obvious if there was a suitor who wanted to do something in a manufacturing capacity, not a heavy industrial use, by redeveloping and doing a product. That's what I'd be proud of. Anyway, that's...
On that note, I think we
On
can
a round
wrap
of
it up.
applause.
Thank you, Sir.
Yeah.
We don't have anything else, do we?
Yep, that's it.
Thank you very much.
Sounds like there might be some further conversation.
John, great.
Every day, a million pounds of crude oil up and down that river with signs on the ship that say no smoking. Okay, every day, LPG is moving up and down the turnpike, up and down the road. Nobody said nothing. No, I'm over in Fallbrook. Is it running? Yeah. I don't think so either. The rest of them's fine. You were up there, what were you up there?